Have you ever wondered how to handle holiday stress with emotional intelligence? You might also be wondering what this has to do with you and DEI. This illustrates also the many facets of emotional intelligence and how to bridge the gap towards DEI. We are so excited to have you here with us today. This conversation is going to offer a lot of support during this holiday season. I am looking forward to you all meeting my co host today. We value your feedback and opinions. Please drop them in the chat. We intend to respond to as many comments and questions from our audience as possible. This takes a great deal of effort to pull off on our part, and I thank you all to my loyal guests. Follow Diversity Connects Us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcast. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a DEI consultant and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The link to purchase the book will be in the comments. For a living, Dr. Rudel, my business partner, and I help organizations implement DEI plans and reframe their cultural mindsets through thought-provoking workshops and webinars. Join us as we continue to share in the varied spaces in DEI. Here with us today is Dr. Rudel, and I will let him introduce himself in his own unique way. How are you today?
I am well. Good afternoon. Always a pleasure to have an opportunity to connect with you all. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Enan Rudel. I'm an organizational psychologist by trade who has spent the last few years researching the human condition and the factors that also, or I should say often, prevent us from functioning optimally across domains.
So when we talk about um, difficult conversations moving into the holiday season, when you were practicing therapy, what sorts of emotions would clients say they were experiencing when the topic of holiday season came up in sessions?
Wow. So, the holidays, first of all, I'll begin from this point. The holiday season means something different to all of us for different reasons. So, one of the things that I found was that this time of year can be particularly um, difficult for some, as it creates sort of this emotional energy. And so I guess what I would say is that it's a particularly emotionally charged time of year, and that would come out. That would come out across sessions, and it didn't matter if I was meeting with individuals, couples, or doing family work. But I can say that from early November straight through to, let's say, early January, one of the main themes of the sessions was sort of related to the holidays and how people were experiencing the holidays, either preparing to enter in or leaning on therapy to help them process something that occurred.
And what is it that you think creates all of this trigger? I know we all feel, um, you do think it's the emotional stress or the anticipation of the guests coming over or you going over there? What, when you think of it, what are some of the challenges and
Yeah.
concerns that patients were bringing to you in that respect?
So I actually think that it was everything that you mentioned. So family dynamics. Let's just just to speak on that for a moment. Um, because of the nature of the holidays, where we often find ourselves sitting at dinner tables across from loved ones that maybe we haven't seen in a while, or even if we have seen them in a while, we're at odds for any number of reasons. It can create some real sort of stress and anxiety, and so that's sort of what I saw in terms of family dynamics. But I would say, sort of broadly speaking, finances can also present as a factor that can lead to stress or any number of emotions. As we know, when you enter into the holidays, you want to try to, for a lot of people, it is centered around sort of gift giving, And the idea of being unable to maybe give all that you would want, to either your children or your loved ones or friends or whomever it is, that can also be a cause of stress as well.
And what were some of the symptoms that they were reportedly experiencing? Can you put your
So
volume up a little bit?
sure, sure. And in fact, maybe what I'll do is, if you give me 1 second here. Um,
Right now you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's much better. It's much clearer.
Excellent. So would you mind repeating that question?
Sure, absolutely. What were some of the symptoms that were reportedly experiencing?
So, anxiety, stress, sleep difficulty, loss of appetite, an inability to focus. So that there really were sort of this broad spectrum of symptoms that seemed to surface that were affecting people across domains. So they're spending their time at work and or at home, worried about the holidays, worried about this conversation and or interaction that was pending. And a lot of times, it seemed to be connected to the idea that, there's an awareness around a difficult conversation that, often needs to be had. And so in the case of my patients, there seemed to be this anxiety around, okay, if I go to, whoever was hosting, when I get there, is such and such going to want to raise this conversation or going to want to engage, in this discussion. And so it would lead to this sort of like perfect storm of, just emotional conflict. And so, again, from early November to early January, that's when I would say I would see the highest volume of patients. And oftentimes it would be people who maybe I was seeing, biweekly or even once a month, now coming weekly. And so in the weeks leading up to the holiday season, it would be sitting with folks, helping them think through some potential strategies for navigating those types of conversations should they arise. And I had prepared some strategies to share today with our listeners. If you don't mind, is now an okay time to sort of get into some of these strategies?
Oh, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so I'll share with you what I would work with patients around, or better yet, what I would encourage. So first and foremost, being present, being fully present in the moment. And I'll tell you why that's important. Oftentimes, it's sitting at the holiday table, just waiting for the other shoe to drop, just waiting
Yeah.
waiting for the conversation to happen, the conversation that you feel in your heart and in your mind is pending. And so that, unfortunately, that does a few things. It hinders you from being fully present and enjoying the moment, but it also causes sort of your thought process to sort of travel down this road of negative thinking. So now we're sort of predicting what we think might happen instead of allowing ourselves or giving ourselves license to just kind of sit in the moment. So there was quite a bit of work done around cognitive reframing and sort of helping people understand that if you enter in to a situation expecting a difficult conversation and or looking for a difficult conversation, it actually increases the likelihood of that conversation not only happening, but that conversation taking place under these sort of heightened, emotionally charged, um, scenarios, right? So the first sort of takeaway would be to be present. Next, to set and communicate boundaries. So I remember this one gentleman who hadn't seen his family in a number of years, and he was really anxious about going to the family dinner at the holidays, because he in his heart felt like a conversation was going to take place. So one of the things that we worked on was setting some boundaries around how long he was going to be there, and what that looked like for him was setting a commitment, that he would be there for 90 minutes. He'd be there essentially for an hour and a half, right? So you're able to say to your family, yes, I'll be there, right? So you're showing up, you're going, you're being a good sport, but you're also honoring your own sort of thoughts and feelings and emotions as well, by sort of setting this boundary around the time that you're going to get there to the time that you will be leaving. So there's that. There's also being open with your loved ones around, the nature of the conversation. What are you okay with? What are you comfortable with? It is okay to say to someone that you understand their perspective, you even value their perspective, but that you're really just there to enjoy your meal, and can this be tabled for another time, right? So it sort of helps to preserve that space for engagement and all the things that holidays in theory should mean. Next, focus on the topic rather than the person. So I'm not sure if you've ever experienced this, but if there's someone that you might be at odds with who is sitting somewhere in the vicinity, and they're sharing a story, how many times do we find ourselves focusing on our thoughts about that person instead of listening to what it is they're actually saying? So what's being suggested here is to simply focus on the story and avoid sort of this any sort of impulses to engage in such a way that could lead to an uncomfortable conversation taking place. And lastly, listening. And I know this is something that you and I have spoken about quite a bit in our time, doing this show together. But where this comes in is in a whole different context. And it's something that I wanted to sort of raise awareness around. You never know what folks are experiencing around the holidays, right? Holidays are a time of great joy, but it's also a time of great grief and grieving, grieving those that are no longer with us, reflecting on what Christmas is or whatever holiday you celebrate, what it used to mean to you. So I think just creating a space to listen for what's being said, but to also listen to what's not being said. Is there someone sitting at that table that's particularly quiet? Is there someone that you've reached out to wish them a happy holiday season, and maybe you haven't heard back from them? Now, that could be for a number of different reasons. They could simply just be caught up with sort of the errands that typically surface around that time of year. What I'm suggesting is to make a space to allow someone to share if need be, because you never know what folks are experiencing. So I'll pause there, because I know I said a lot, but just to sort of recap, be present, communicate boundaries, focus on the topic rather than the person, and listen. And
Right.
those are sort of the 4 strategies that I would recommend as we enter into the holiday season.
I think what also happens while we enter, basically any holiday, is the narrative
Mhm.
that we have already conjured up in our minds. And we bring that narrative into all the spaces that we enter. And especially during the holidays, I think that narrative continues to replay and it's amplified now once present at any dinner table, where now you're revising in your mind, creating a story of how this conversation can pan out. And you mentioned something that's really important is staying present. And I think that's what it is, because as you're creating your story in your head, you're not present. You're
Right.
not actually focusing on what the person's saying or receiving the information or taking the time to reflect. And establishing the boundaries, I know, is another strategy you mentioned. I think that's a big one, because often as empaths and people who want to please others or are very generous with their time don't really have those boundaries. And to be able to, to use no as a full sentence and to understand that it's not the time to have that conversation might be very difficult for someone who doesn't know how to establish the boundaries.
Absolutely. And that's where I would find myself working with them leading up to the holiday season, right? For most of us, it's a challenge. For most of us, it's a struggle, right? Most individuals at their core, you want to be accessible to your loved ones. You want to be able to engage in conversation and interact with them in a meaningful way. But how do you do that and still honor your own thoughts and feelings and reflections on whatever it is that you might be sitting with? So, this idea of pre-work can be really valuable. So, knowing that there might be an opportunity for a difficult conversation or difficult interaction, that right there is grounds enough to sort of take a step back and ask yourself, what is it that you need to be able to engage in that interaction in a meaningful way? So there's a few steps involved there. First, it's really getting a pulse check on what's surfacing for you. What are your feelings at the moment, right? So there's that. Next, who's involved? And this is where we sort of get into either it could be family dynamics, or loved ones or friends or whomever, but it's really now gathering your thoughts on the nature of that relationship and the trajectory of that relationship. So now you've done some self-reflection around what you're feeling. You've now reflected on the nature of the relationship. Now thinking about sort of, how do you want to be in that space? How do you want to show up in that space? And if the answer is, hey, I just want to have a good time, then the next thought is, what do I need to do to secure that?
Right.
And while we can't control others, we can, we do have full autonomy over how we show up and what we choose to engage in versus what we choose not to engage in. So in that pre-work, it's really sort of laying out a game plan so that when you get there, you're going to be there for whatever length of time. If part of your pre-work has been to determine, okay, I'm going to be there for 90 minutes, right? Let's say for argument's sake, that's the case. Okay, fine. You're going to be there for 90 minutes. You know what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with. You're able to set the kind of boundaries that will allow you to sort of move in a way that allows you to show up as your best self. So, these are sort of the steps, again, that I would consider to increase the likelihood of having an enjoyable experience.
Right. There's a LinkedIn user. Thank you for chiming in today. We appreciate your support. Here they're saying, how do you support people in the workplace that might have those personal pressures in this season?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would actually use these same sort of strategies. I would encourage to some degree these strategies also be used, across domains, right? So we've spent our time thus far today talking about sort of like the get-togethers, but even in the workplace, it's being open with folks around setting those boundaries, and being aware and in tune with what's surfacing for you, because oftentimes another thing that happens is when the holidays are a particularly trying time period,
Hmm.
you do run the risk of it coming out in these little ways across your life domains, right? So maybe you're short with people at work, you're not as patient. So it's important to be aware of all that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you speak of the importance of cognitive reframing? I know there's a LinkedIn user who said, absolutely.
Yeah.
He says, or they say cognitive reframing, yes. And I
Yeah.
think we should maybe probably elaborate more on that.
Sure. So if we consider the connection between our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions in that order, and understanding that there's a direct connection between what we think and what we do, with that as sort of the overarching sort of understanding, then framing your perspective in a healthy way matters. It matters because if you have a negative framing, you very well might respond in a way that matches that.
Right. I have something to add to that though. So if there is already an emotion that you're already experiencing, I think it's really important to de-escalate that emotion, especially like you said, if it's a negative one, to be able to reframe your cognitive process. Otherwise, it won't be able to be possible to reframe from, let's say, an angry state or a sad state or a fearful state.
Yes. Yeah. And that goes back to that awareness, because it's never linear.
Mm,
Like, and so it's I guess when I say that, as our thoughts shift, our feelings shift, our perspective shifts, right? So it's important to be in tune and aware with ourselves, particularly when you're entering into potentially emotionally charged environments.
right. And the preparedness that
Mhm.
takes, like you mentioned, being self-aware.
Yeah.
Part of emotional intelligence is to be able to be self-aware, to be able to manage the emotions, and then to be able to manage the emotions of others. And they're
Mhm.
self-regulating as well.
Yeah.
And I think it really takes, again, we mentioned, staying in the moment. That could be a whole topic in and of itself, because when we're in our minds following the narrative, we think that is the moment,
Yeah.
because we're actually living it and we're telling the story to ourselves over and over, and it's constantly being repeated throughout the day. And like you mentioned, we're carrying these in different spaces.
Yeah.
So, there's I think there's a gap
Mhm.
that needs to occur when you step back. I'll give you a great example. So my daughter goes through her emotions, and now we've been able to put a word to each emotion, because when they're young, they don't have that concept. They scream, they yell, they pull, they cry because they don't have the words. And I realized as she was getting older, those emotions were still occurring.
Mhm.
And because at the time, I didn't have the wherewithal to say, oh, this is sad. And is this how you feel when you're sad? That, if we were in a mall, I was like, oh, that's inappropriate. And then just move on. But now that I understand that, there is, even for children, they have to be able to know that there is a word that goes with the emotion, and that emotion that they're feeling is validated. So, she's emotionally charged at the moment. The emotion is validated. And how do we de escalate? because then once you de-escalate, then you bring the person back into being in the moment and present.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so it's, you know, it's such it's a dance when you think of it that way, right? Because there's this awareness around what's happening for self, but then there's also this attunement with what's going on for the other person, and in sort of trying to manage that energy in the middle, which of course is easier said than done. But when we talk about being, present, to your point, there's a lot there.
Right.
It's emotional intelligence, it's mindfulness, it's use of self. There's all of these really heavy concepts that might be worth us even teasing apart in the weeks to come, because I think that this could be a really helpful platform, for our listeners as we move deeper into the holiday season.
Right. And what advice would you offer to our listeners as a takeaway to help them stay centered throughout the holidays?
So I would say to pay mind to that connection between thoughts, feelings, and actions, and be aware of what it is that you're doing, and to take those critical moments to pause and sort of check in with yourself. Why am I reacting this way? What's the thought that's informing this behavior or this action? What do I hope to accomplish by doing whatever it is, right, that you are doing? But I would encourage sort of staying sort of centered, and what that looks like for me personally is, as close to my best self as I can be in that moment. There'll be plenty of time to engage in whatever the conversation is that needs to be had, but this moment may not be the best moment.
Right.
When considering sort of the purpose of coming together, right? So when we're thinking about holiday get-togethers, if the purpose is to come together and find ways to enjoy one another's company, then the question on the table is sort of, what is it that I need to do to sort of uphold that vision?
Right. This definitely needs a part two. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm positive that this would, make for another show in terms of being self-aware. I think because that's where it really stems from, and that's where it
Yeah.
starts,
Yeah.
in being able to manage the intricacies of probably a plethora of emotions that we go throughout the day, and
Mm-hmm.
how it could affect, our workspace.
Yeah.
But, as we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour, I want to thank you all for listening. This podcast highlights experiences and inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We share profound and courageous dialogues that influence DEI and emotional intelligence by breaking the barriers and labels of stereotypes, confronting biases, and offering best practices to achieve a more significant and cultural mindset. Stay tuned as we continue to share our voices in the DEI space. To trend with us, #Diversity Connects Us.